So my name is Ross Simson. I head up data at Thames Water, and I've got the privilege of introducing our panel and discussion today. GDPR 18 months on, does it matter? I think is one of the interesting questions that we're going to look at. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce ourselves, give you a bit of background about what gives us the right to be up here. I'll get the panel to introduce themselves, and then we've got some questions that we're going to discuss, and then what I'm going to do is to bring a roving mic out into the audience and you can ask your questions and put everybody on the spot as well, if that works. Yeah? Cool. Okay, so Ross Simpson, I head up data at Thames Water. Essentially what that means for me is I look after data quality, data governance, data architecture, the platform and tooling, and then we've also moved to using Agile, and we've got a number of Scrum teams now where we're developing new products. Clearly we've got lots of customers, so around 8 million customers where we supply 2.8 billion litres of water per day to hopefully some of you, which is clean and tasty. And what I'm going to do now is just introduce the rest of the panel as we go down. So Di, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you?
I'm Di Davis. I'm a geek lawyer, which means basically that I'm an engineer and a lawyer. I do as little GDPR as I can get away with, by which I mean if I just did GDPR I think I'd get bored out of my skull, so I do lots of other things like IT and interesting overlaps of technology and law.
Okay, James.
How do you do? I'm James Palmer. I'm currently the Data Protection Officer for Hastings Direct in the insurance sector. Prior to that I worked for Southern Water as Head of Data Governance, but actually my 100% of task of being the Head of Data Governance was GDPR implementation. And prior to that I worked in public sector for many, many years, and we're looking at the policing model and information management, information collection, and the analytical infrastructure and the legal framework that goes around that. So my specialism really is data protection.
Cool, thank you. Sebastian.
Yeah, hi. My name is Sebastian Weyer. I'm the CEO of Statice. We're a German-based company focusing on data anonymization. So we solve a very clear part, but nevertheless very important part of GDPR, which is protecting off user and customer data for our clients.
Cool, thank you. And Nicola.
Last but not least, me. So my name is Nicola Askham. I'm known as the Data Governance Coach, and I spend all my time helping companies be more successful at doing their data governance, and that takes a variety of forms. I do lots of training, coaching, and also some hands-on consulting. And I think 2-3 years ago, people were asking me if I would do data protection. I'm going, no, data protection's got nothing to do with data governance. They're nothing to do with each other. And one of the clients I was with at the time was a real kind of, well, actually it's all hands on deck, you're here anyway, you know everybody who knows about data, kind of please help. And I actually realised through getting my head around there that actually there's a great deal of overlap now, and actually data governance really supports GDPR, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about that later. Well, I hope so.
Yeah, we will. So let's get to know our audience a bit better. How many data protection officers have we got in? 2? 3? Okay. Anybody working in data governance? Okay, so a few more data governance. So let's have a look. Who should we pick on?
I work in data governance for WorldPay. So initially I was starting as data quality, but now shifting more into broader spectrum of things.
Thank you.
My name is Jide, and I'm the data reporting lead for Southern Water. Yeah, and basically because obviously I work with a water company, and what we do a lot of regulatory reporting, and that's where I get involved.
So one of the things we've got a lot on the panel is background in insurance. So legal and general, let's have a chat. What do you do?
Hi, I'm Bernadette David, and I work for Legal General as the Operations and Governance Manager, but spend most of my time doing operations and now needing to go into governance and control.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so as you'll gather, I'm going to make this interactive whether you like it or not. So in terms then of the first question, some of you, most of you, who was anybody born after the year 2000? Good. Okay, so in IT there was a big thing called Y2K. We spent millions and millions of pounds developing systems that were Y2K compliant, and planes were going to fall out the sky and nobody wanted to fly on New Year's Eve. Let's just have a show of hands. Has GDPR made an impact on you as an individual or as an individual in your company? The answer, yes. Let's just have the hands up. Okay, so about a third. Interesting. Okay. Sebastian, let's start with you then, because obviously your company does a lot of work in healthcare and financial and insurance and helps anonymise information. So let me ask you, do you feel more secure in your professional life as a result of GDPR?
More secure, that's a good question. I think we see a lot from, or at least in the company, we see a lot from our customers, and we realize that while on the outside a lot of companies portray be very ready, I think the opposite is still quite true. Personally, I think we always had this feeling, right, in May last year when we woke up all of a sudden and we opened our favorite news site and all of a sudden this big cookie banner popped up and we said, oh cool, it's happening. Something's really happening. You thought, okay, this might be first good step. I think that feeling kind of faded away over time because I'm realizing the more you really scratch there on the surface of how your personal data is potentially collected by companies, you realize that it's not very done just entirely compliant as of now, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? That's what we see from websites, for example, companies still having the pre-opt in and all of these things that really should not be happening anymore. So I would say we're in a good path. We're not quite there just yet, and that's personally. Professionally as well. What I think we see now 18 months later is a lot of companies getting slowly ready to be very much compliant with the base of it, saying, okay, we have everything in place that we're allowed to store data. And if you look at the data value chain where we come in with anonymization is very much at the end of that, where it comes to, okay, we're fine with the base, we'd now like to go further and actually do something more explorative with data. And we see a spike in conversations around that in the recent months. So I think we're slowly getting there.
Okay. Same question to you.
I was going to say, can I jump in on that? I think it's quite useful when you started the conversation by saying as a consumer. And I think if everybody in the audience, if they sort of think of themselves as the individual in the first instance and handing out your data liberally to everyone over the internet and everywhere that anyone asks for it, do you actually feel any more secure under GDPR than under the Data Protection Act of 98?
Who feels more secure about their data and the use of it as a result of GDPR?
Yeah, I think as a consumer, I don't think we do feel that. I think one of the side effects of GDPR is the big sort of publicity around it, and also the fact that we're starting to see some fines. I mean, not many coming out of the UK, but some fair certain coming out of Europe at the moment. And actually, I sit there as a consumer thinking it's putting the fear of God into me because it's much more open now. It's much more thinking about it. But then I put my DPO hat on and think, brilliant, it is being talked about more. It is being much more in the public eye. And I think every one of us as a consumer is going to drive that because one of the things, and we very quickly talked about it, is DSARs, data subject access requests. We took, the company I currently work for took a 3,000% increase in DSARs because people became much more aware of what information is out there and what have you got about me. So I think the consumer idea is, I sort of think as a consumer, I don't feel as though my data's that much more secure because I'm reading lots more about it. I put my DPO head on and think brilliant.
So let's have a show of hands. How many people have done a subject access request to a company in the last 12 months? 3, 4, 5. Right, let's go into the audience. Tell me about your experience of it.
I used to head up data strategy for British Gas, so when I left to join Dentsu Aegis, digital marketing company, I thought, why not? That was one of my projects at the time, so let's see how good they are. No.
Who else has done one? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, my name is Saad Sheikh. I'm from Morgan Sindall, a construction company. I'm the data protection officer there. I did one in my last workplace, which was a Solicitors Regulation Authority, and I just wanted to see what they do in terms of DSARs. My particular concern doing DSARs at the moment in my current business is emails. So if there's an email conversation between someone and it mentions that person's name, it might not be specific PII, but it's in that context. I wanted to see my old place how they talk about me like that. So I did get some emails, but obviously a lot of it heavily redacted. So my question probably to the panel and to probably yourself is, in terms of email conversations, and if it's relevant to the data subject, do you include that? If it just say their first name, or if it's in their context, so if their manager's talking about them, it's just their first name or their full name, is that relevant or not?
So I'll start with that one, because for a year of my time I was working at Sainsbury's Group, helping them actually with the DSARS process and GDPR, and it's a really interesting one because we had a disgruntled employee, and they wanted to have all communications in email for the last 3 years analysed. It took 4 people 6 months to do that analysis, and we had to comply because of the way that the subject access request was written, which probably cost more than the grievance amount that we could have paid them in return. So it's an interesting one. What, from a legal point of view, what do you think we should do?
I think I was going to say 2 things. First of all, if you look at the Information Commission Officer's stats, you will see that there's been a massive spike in subject access requests post-employment. In fact, it's almost de rigueur. If you're going to have a dispute with your previous employer, you're going to do a subject access request. It's and lots. There is I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it's a huge percentage of subject access requests are now related to employment, which is bad for me because I used to get these requests from people who've never had a subject access request in their life, and then an employee left and the subject access request didn't know what to do. Now almost everybody expects them. But going back to the question you actually asked, which is, what information do you have to provide? Okay, there's 2 answers to this. If I'm giving the answer to a information by which I mean to a somebody who's responding to the subject access request, a data protection officer, I would say not very much. The reality is, if the data protection officer decides he's not going to give very much information away, and this is what I advise companies all the time, don't give very much information away to the employee. What's the worst the employee's going to do? Well, the employee's going to send off a stroppy letter to the ICO. What's the ICO going to do? Bin it. They're not interested in getting involved with an employee-employer dispute. So the practical answer from an employer's perspective is you don't have to give very much information at all. The legal answer to what information you have to provide is actually not very much either. Certainly, the mere fact that A sent an email to B is not personal information. Personal information is information that you use in respect of that individual. So the reality is you don't have to say, I received 500 emails from this individual between the 1st of March and the 1st of June. That's not personal information in that context. You only have to give the sort of information that you are recording about that employee as an employee, perhaps health history, time at work, time off work. That's the only thing that you are required to provide, not a list of all emails and contents of all emails.
Nicola, what do you advise your clients?
Well, I'm not a data protection expert, so I'll have to opt out on this one. So I just tell you how data governance helps. Not, I wouldn't dare dream of answering that one.
I'd be interested to understand if the DPO at the back actually agreed with that assessment. You did.
Do you want? I can give you the mic.
Yeah, you are. I think that's correct, because the issue we have, we've got, obviously when you get DSARS, we have clever tools to find the emails, but it's a hassle getting all those emails, and it's obviously on a contextual basis. So there's a lot of legal information out there from solicitors and stuff saying you should provide it in this context, but it's obviously an interpretation. Obviously, there's a lot of legal cases come out as well. So I mean, Durant v against Financial Conduct Authority is a recent one, saying that they shouldn't have to provide everything. So it's quite welcoming, and I really appreciate the answer provided. So that's really helped me out.
I think I agree with bits of it, but not all of it. There is case law in force at the moment under the 98 Act that suggested that when it comes to DSARS, the scope of what is covered by a DSAR now is absolutely wide. I think the bit that we previously discussed is, are we sitting on a pedestal of, well, they don't actually know what we got, so Therefore, we can pick and choose what we give out. Case law suggests that if you hold anything about an individual, and it doesn't have to be directly personal information, it can be opinions, it can be thought processes. If it's written down and it's attributed to that individual, then it is disclosable under a DSAR. Some of the angst and the pain that we're all feeling when it comes to DSARs is the research and the search and the redaction piece. I go back to the most painful DSARs that any company is going to get is from an ex-employee, because they know how much we've got and they know how good or bad we've stored it.
So I think the interesting one on that is, I'd challenge you on that point. I think the most interesting DSAR request that we saw was from a investigative journalist who'd won Pulitzer Prizes for the Times newspaper, who sent one in, and it was a 3-page DSAR request that went through to the nth degree of detail that we had to then respond to.
Have you seen the template that's floating around the internet?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, it was worse than that, trust me. So one of my questions is, just then, if I may, to the audience. Give me a show of hands if you know where your personal customer data is stored. So let me explain what I mean by that. So again, if I go back to Sainsbury's Group, we had 250 systems. We spent a year understanding where our first of all, a definition of what is personal customer information. Secondly, then what information is it stored in? And then third of all, how could we then extract it? And then there were some systems, and if I go to where I currently work, our customer information system that we're just replacing was built in 1971 and is still green screen. So if you look at all of your information that's stored in all of your customers, all of your CRM systems and everything else, who knows where their customer data is stored today? Isn't that interesting? So that was a show of about 6 or 7 hands out of the entire group. So then my next question to the panel is, on that basis then, is GDPR working?
Would you describe it as work in progress?
What do you think?
Obviously, I very much view everything through the lens of data governance. I think I see companies generally being more aware and conscious of their data as a result of GDPR, but I don't know whether they're there yet in terms of full compliance.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say that in any large or medium-sized company, no single individual knows where all the data is, and even if you get these very sophisticated tools which try and sniff out the answer to that, they don't work because they don't take account of written down data, which is still data for GDPR purposes, but doesn't necessarily matter, because what really matters is whether all the people who actually interact with that personal data have sufficient knowledge of GDPR to be able to comply with it.
I think, with the data protection geek that I am, is it working? Yes. I think it's much more in the focus than the 98 Act ever was. When you look at the 98 Act, it had a £500,000 maximum fine. Is GDPR in everyone's focus purely because of the exponential, accelerated fines and structures and those regulatory frameworks that are in place? Yes, I think it is. But I think, personally, if I put myself on the consumer side, that's a good thing. Because I think, when you look at, and I'm going to be a bit bold and say the American data model, where if you give your personal data to a company, they can do what the hell they like with it, and they can make money off it off the back of anything they like. And certainly the fear that they're getting when the California legislation's coming in, and certain other states now looking at that type of control that GDPR is, that they're actually panicking on that. Some of the bit that when we say it's a journey, absolutely agree, because there was that piece where they were saying there was an assumption made that when GDPR come in, all we do is take the bits that GDPR, the new stuff in GDPR, and build it on top of our 98 models. None of us were really complying with the 98 Act, so actually GDPR implementation became huge. It was a pain. It was really painful. So I think, yes, I've seen it getting better and better. I think as a consumer, it's a good place it's going. I think we're not there yet. Will we ever get there? Yes, I agree. There's a tipping point. Does it turn into the 98 Act and become that sort of piece? But at the moment, I think it's a positive. I'm seeing lots of positive. The people I talk to, the DPO at the back, these types of questions of DSARs, it's an absolute pain on DSARs. But you could say it's a good thing, and hoping that we reach the peak and it starts to ease off soon.
Cool. So I've got one question to the audience. Show of hands, who is currently GDPR compliant?
Don't anyone put their hand up, please. Don't do it.
Okay, so that, I think 18 months on, that says that we're on a journey still.
I saw a sales pitch, because you alluded to it, the GDPR Y2K moment. I saw a sales pitch, a sign that said, "We'll make you GDPR compliant in 14 days." And that little voice on my shoulder said, "Go and ask them what their insurances are like, because on the 15th day I'm going to sue the hell out of them." Yeah, it was those types of things.
So in terms of legislation, we've all seen some of the big fines that are coming out. A couple of years ago we did some analysis to show who works in the public sector. Right, well, you're most at risk, because under the old rules 98% of fines were for the public sector, 2% for private companies. Now, because of the amounts that's involved, it becomes quite interesting. Sebastian, Germany, Mrs. Merkel, what's she trying to do?
Good question. I think what's interesting in Germany, especially working with the data protection agencies, they're very good to tell you what not to do. They suck a lot at telling you what to do. I'm going to say that quite bluntly, because we work closely with them in developing what we're working on as well, and we realize it's very difficult to get a good guidance on, okay, what is appropriate and what should we actually also do as a company, but also this holds for other companies who are trying to get their systems in place and get their whole infrastructure in place properly. And it's very frustrating at points where there's no clear guideline on, okay, what's actually acceptable and what would be seen as compliant according to the governmental agencies in this case. I think what we've seen recently as well, we just briefly talked about that before the panelists, that there's now guidelines coming out building a fine framework that she wants to push across the EU on making small issues fine quite massively, which obviously, in my opinion, does not go in the right direction, because you're inducing fear on something that should be actually solved with actual tangible solutions and right measures in order to enable companies to work with data and not go the other way around and make them afraid of doing so.
So potentially, if we stay in Europe, then that legislation will be impacted on us as well, then, I guess. So, nobody's mentioned the Brexit vote. Who's voting for Remain?
You've missed the boat. The vote's done, isn't it?
Well, you could argue. Interesting question. Okay. Nicola, how do you think good data governance can help with GDPR?
That's a good question, one I can answer confidently. I think, my view is that you shouldn't be doing data governance from a regulatory point of view, and I think that pre-GDPR I worked with quite a lot of organisations that did, and I was lucky enough to start working with companies that said, yes, we've got regulatory requirement, we want to do it wider. And I was actually working with one company at the time that GDPR came in, and they said, can you help me? And I'm going, no, I know nothing about this. But it was by going along to their program meetings and obviously taking the time to understand GDPR that I suddenly realised that my whole approach to data governance I decided to transfer to GDPR is just make it as simple as possible. So I did some analysis of GDPR, and I worked out the requirements are in 6 buckets, and I decided that 2 of them are the legally marketing permission security stuff that I know nothing about and never will be expert on it, and the other 4 are all things that good data governance gives you: accountability, documentation, knowing where your data is flowing through the organisation, what it's being used for. And so despite my initial resistance of being pulled into a GDPR program, I'm suddenly going, this Article 30 thing you're talking about, I've just gone and done some reading about it. Why are you documenting all that over there, and you've got a data governance team over here documenting very similar, if not the same, information? And you've probably all seen it in projects in your organisations. People document things, then lose them. But if you've got a data governance framework in place, it's all getting documented in one place. You've got a team who's responsible for making sure that is regularly reviewed with the business and updated. So that first organisation, I found that really, really worked. We added to our data glossary to hold the data required for Article 30, and it was working so well that even though I'm not a data protection expert and I don't normally get employed to help with GDPR, whichever client I'm working at the time, I normally go, where's your data protection officer? Where's the team? Let's tell them what you can do as a data governance team, because you've already engaged all your senior stakeholders, got them thinking about data and making decisions on it. So you've kind of started to break down those silos and getting people talking to you about data anyway.
You want a question? Yeah, sure. Let me bring this over.
I'm Juliet Samuel. I write for The Telegraph. And I have a question about whether, given some of what you've said, do you think that, so on the one hand you could say that GDPR is a competitive advantage because it forces companies to sort out their data. On the other hand, you could say it's a massive disadvantage compared to, say, Chinese tech companies that don't have to worry about privacy at all. So I wonder which you think it is.
That's very interesting.
Go on, you go for it, and I think we'll then have a legal point as well.
About it. And I have to sort of caveat my answer with it's a personal opinion.
Because there's now press in the room.
And press in the room. I'm always guided what I say anyway. But I put my consumer hat back on, and I think that it's a bit like, well, is the horse already bolted? The big pockets of data out in the world, have I already exposed my entire world to everyone anyway? And I think that what we're trying to do with certainly European legislation, in my mind, is just put some of that control back into our hands as a consumer. So, you know, if companies do have my data, I want to know what they've got. Much more. I think GDPR is much more sort of individual focused than it was company focused, as the 98 Act, I think, was actually a bit more business focused. So when it comes to the sort of big data scoopers and hoovers and scrapers in the world, I think, you know, the horse has already bolted. But in the EU, it's like, do we want to be part of the issue or part of the resolve, the resolution to that? And I think we've taken the higher step to take that on. The US is following us. We've already talked about that. When you look at some of the legislation and the talk that's going on, that there is a desire and a realization of what that looked like. When you look at the recent Facebook fine of $5 billion, drop in the ocean for them, I'm sure. But it's sending the right message, I think. So, yeah, it's a constant head-butting dilemma, I think.
I think you've got a response.
The Europeans are a bunch of idiots. I mean, the answer to your question is, yeah, it's bleeding obvious. Why would you establish a business in Europe unless you have to? Twitter does not have any assets in the UK. It does not have any assets in Europe. Why?
That's why they changed
because
the territorial
it doesn't have
scope.
to comply with European Union law. Why on earth would you set up a business if you had the wherewithal to do it in a country which regulates you to the extent that GDPR does? So GDPR is great, yeah, that's what the Europeans say to themselves, but in reality it's not, because it only affects people with assets or businesses, including everybody in this room, in the Europe.
But that's wrong, though, isn't it? They've changed the territorial scope.
Yeah, but you can't find people if they don't have any assets in the country.
And I agree with that bit. I agree with that bit. I think in the change of the territorial scope, that was an attempt to try and draw in a lot of these businesses that sat outside of the EU. There's always the skeptics and the ideas of, well, how are you going to reach them? There's always that, but there's an attempt to be made in to pull them in. I agree. Under the 98 Act, if you didn't have a footprint, didn't matter. But the world of data, and I think this is the head-butting.
Right, let's just get one example.
Data's getting bigger and bigger.
One example, and this really gets up my way. Okay, so we all agree that child pornography is bad. I hope. Good. All right. So in 1998, there was the first European Union get-together of home ministers to determine what a child is. Who's a child? 13, 16, 17 as the Germans would say. Here we are, 21 years later, they cannot still tell you who a child is. So yes, child pornography is bad, but we don't know what a child is. And here you've got GDPR, and of course we've got some contentious point like what a child is. Well, I couldn't agree, so let's just have anywhere between 13 and 16, make your own mind up on a country-by-country basis.
So, Sebastian, picking up on one of Di's points, you set up your company in Berlin. Are you stupid?
Definitely don't hope so. No, the thing is, I do not entirely disagree. I don't entirely agree with the statement that it's just a European topic. I mean, privacy is a global topic. It's a global trend, and it's an ethical question more than it's a commercial question right now. Do we want to stand the right side of history and how we treat people's data and how we actually treat our personal asset, which is our data? In the short term, I agree, it's a tough task, and it's definitely something that we need to be able to work on quite hard, and we're far from being perfect at that point. I think in the long run, it makes perfect business sense as well, next to being an ethical question, right? If you're able to set up all your systems properly, you're compliant with what we call GDPR right now, which will be in California, new law coming up, Singapore is quite strict. There are a lot of global laws in the same direction. It makes perfect business sense as well, because at that point, you're actually a trusted, reliable partner. So, are we stupid to be in Berlin? I don't think so, for several reasons, but especially one because I think being in Europe and being part of GDPR makes perfect business sense. It's true.
I think that I have to agree. It starts off with an ethical question, and I think you don't do data governance just because it's something nice to do. There's a foundation to it. There's a value to it. And data protection, I have to totally disagree with this with this sort of stance. Really, is that data protection is an ethical issue. We talk about ethical algorithms. We talk about ethical AI. We talk about some of the mistakes that can be made when we build out these data landscapes and these algorithms. And it doesn't come from a commercial sense. The mistakes come from the commercial sense. It's the ethical piece that the desire to do it right. I came from a criminal sort of law bits, and every one of you sat here has to comply with criminal law. You can choose to comply with it or not. That's your choice. If I advocate don't comply with criminal law, you'll take the consequences of that. And so we have to actually take a stance of you should comply. You must comply with GDPR. Because the law says you will. If you take a stance of, I'm not going to comply because commercially it's unsound or I can't be bothered because it's too much effort, then I'm going to always dispute that stance.
Very interesting. Yeah, please.
May I share my experience? I'm Kimi from Taiwan. Actually, we are afraid to click on the news about the Hong Kong protest because if we click on the news on the Facebook, we are afraid if I enter China or Hong Kong, I will be missed it. This is the why we have to comply the Chinese government's policies.
And I think that's a brilliant, and I got goosebumps when you said that, because that's an absolutely ethical reason why we need to control personal data, and if we've got these big data hoovers scooping up all of this personal data about individuals and then putting it to another use, and please forgive me when I say this, but there's a good book out there called The Nazis and the Nazi Census, and it really alludes to the fact why we have data protection today. And the contracts that were signed by IBM and the Nazis at the time in order to be able to allow for the atrocities that took place, because the data was the core of all of that.
Hi, my name is Faith, and I'm a MSc in public policy candidate, and I'm just curious. I'll just share my experience as a Kenyan. So in 2017, allegedly Cambridge Analytica worked with the government to manipulate the elections, and that resulted in a very controversial period in Kenya, almost violent. And I guess Cambridge Analytica was also involved in Trump's election as well. So as an aspiring data protection officer or something of the sort, like, what can you do when it's the government violating the laws?
That's a great question. Who wants to pick that one up?
Is it me again?
Go on then.
A lot of difficulty. A data protection officer, so I always advocate myself as the legal advisory. I can't force people to comply with a piece of legislation. What I see a hell of a lot of time is the role of a data protection officer is only compulsory in three scenarios, and two of those are a self-assessment. So it's a new function. GDPR only brought in DPO as a compulsory post when that came into force. So you're having lots of conversations with lots of people that had different ideas for many, many years, and you're now trying to convince them that the really good idea they had 15 years ago wasn't really a very good idea. And many a conversation. Certainly, have you any data analysts in the room? Put their hands up. So a data analyst wants more data. Give me more and more data, the most amount of data I can have, and I can enrich the answer that you wish. And I have to come along and say, you can have some of it, but you can't have all of it, and you can't have that bit, but you can have that bit. So trying to convince a government or a public sector department that you need to start thinking in an ethical manner is quite a difficult thing to do. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have these conversations and continue to have them.
And I think, building on that point, GDPR is about people. It's not about technology. And I think also the way that you challenge this is through cultural change. I think what we have to do is we have to stand up for our rights, and in certain countries that's very, very difficult because, we've got freedom of speech. In other countries, as we've heard of from now, we don't. But I think if enough people stand up for it and turn around and say, this is not right, so it becomes an ethical choice about what people do and how they do it, I think that's the thing. And I think that's really where looking after data at Thames Water, I, along with our data protection officer, with our legal team and with our security team, if somebody, we're part of the national infrastructure, if somebody poisons water reservoirs, people die. Yeah? So that for the same point of view, I have a viewpoint that says we have an ethical and moral right to look after not only our employee data but our customer data as well, to the best of our abilities, which is why we put in place a program just after I started, which was 15 months long, and we've now got data governance. So we've got a data governance board at board level, we've got accountability at the exec level, and we then have 3 boards that then report into them on data quality, on data protection and data security. And one of my questions back to the group would be just now, and I saw a hand go up there, so I'll answer that in a minute, but how many of you now have a data protection culture in your organisation? Okay, so going back to my cultural point, you're here to listen and you're here to take advice. What I would do is please stand up, be accountable, and make change. Be the voice of change. Be the data conscience within your organisations and legislate to your senior managers and directors to say they must change. And that, for me, is the biggest change that's happened around GDPR.
Well, can I answer the lady's question?
Please.
Because she asked a question, it was a very valid question, which was about countries complying with GDPR or data protection. If you think about it, every single country in the world, or virtually every single country in the world, has to comply with GDPR. Why? Because they all have tourist offices and they all try and encourage you to go and visit those countries, and they all gather data about you as part of what they do for a living. They're gathering information about European citizens, they have to comply with GDPR. I was approached by 2 countries, I'm not going to tell you who they are, to tourist officers to help them with GDPR. One of them has done it. The other one, we'll do it, eventually die. They haven't given the word to anybody else. I know they're not going to give the word to anybody else. They just haven't got round to it. They've got lots of other things to do. And if you don't believe me, go and have a look, because every single country tourist office should have a GDPR privacy policy. Do they? No, because they're not that interested, and they do have, of course, assets in the UK, but they're not going to get fined. They're not. The ICO wouldn't take another country on. It's too big a target for the ICO. So you talk about cultural change, but my question as a lawyer, commercial lawyer, is where's the driver? You mentioned fines, but these are civil fines, not criminal fines, and anyway, countries are exempt from those sort of things. Where's the driver? A compliance for other countries.
Right.
Yeah, that was a question.
Yeah. I think it was a question. I think you and I come from different stances of, we're looking at the same issue but from different lenses. I think I would sort of turn it around and say, where's your driver for being compliant with all criminal law? And I think that comes from within. If you advocate the fact that, well, you're never going to be caught by the police, or you're never going to be caught by somebody, so just commit any crime you want to, that's the wrong message. I think the driver should be within first. I think if all we're doing is saying, well, actually the driver is the fines, then yeah, okay, you're going to see the multiple compliance pieces come out of Europe, because obviously that's where they can easily grab hold of that company, and I think you're going to see those wider reaches of governments and countries not complying. I absolutely agree with that, because we already agreed that the reach into those countries is very hard and very difficult. So I think for me, driver within. If it's just a commercial issue, then that's a different conversation.
I think one thing to add there. In the end, it has to be the consumer, in my opinion. Privacy itself is something that has to stem from the consumer. It has to be actual consumer behavioral issue as well. If people or customers or consumers actually do start, or let's put it differently, don't care, nothing will ever change, because it's something in the end we will actually make happen or not happen in this case. But in the end, as we said, the regulation is something that was written for people and individual rights and actually taking control of our data, which is everybody here and everybody in the world. As you said, globally, it's a global issue. And that means that starting from the consumers, this is where actually something has to happen, and that has commercial impact for companies. If companies realize consumers care about them being compliant or not, this will be something that has massive impact on them having to change as well.
From my point of view, yeah, I think Sebastian's right, and I would echo that. And I think as a just people generally, as consumers, we're much more data aware. I mean, obviously panelists were probably all fairly data aware anyway, but as a community and a culture, we're much more aware of data and our rights around data. And I think we're starting to be picky about who we do business with as a result of that. I mean, I certainly am, and people I talk to choose that, and I think that's going to kind of fits in very much with what you were saying, James.
And I think if I put the consumer hat back on, and you'll hear that a lot from me. I try and get executives to think that way rather than commercially. And you think, so how many of us in this room now have lodged our credit cards with various internet sites or various bits and sit with WorldPay and those books, and actually just assume, oh yeah, they're looking after our stuff for us, and we just assume that there's that security in place. And this is where we should demand it more as a consumer. I want that security, and what we're now finding out in some of the big cases with the 99 million fines and the 180 million pound fines that are coming out is because they weren't doing security right, or there were some little pieces in there that they knew about was an issue 2 years ago but never did anything about it because commercially it was unsound to do it. It would cost us more. So actually commercially they're running roughshod over some of those issues, and I think it is. I totally agree. The drive can come from us as a consumer and say, well, I expect more. I do expect more.
Okay, so we're starting to run out of time. So I've got one more question, and then I want to see if I can give you some value from the panel as well to actually get them to give you what their top GDPR tip is. So I'll give you a minute to think about what that is.
I will try to be fast. So back to the point on businesses that has been discussed is I actually agree with the controversial point that businesses would fare better in China with no legislation, but legislation comes from us in a democracy, so we wanted this. And if we see some of the opportunities that have come from people using new technologies before even GDPR, so using DuckDuckGo, which has a different model around how it handles data, what I would like to ask is, how about GDPR as a business opportunity, driving a different kind of business?
Go on then.
Well, my short answer is come to my session at 3:10 when I'll be telling people how Company A can sue Company B for lots of money, because that's something that most people have missed under GDPR. You can use it as a commercial sword rather than a shield, but I'm not going to start talking about that now. But suffice to say that there are lots and lots of bits of GDPR which most people forget about because they simply concentrate on, we've got to be secure, we mustn't have data leaks. There's a lot more to GDPR than that.
I think from my point of view, I think being compliant with GDPR, it's been a great thing for actually making people a lot more data aware in their organisations, and it might have come from the regulatory stick, but people across the whole organisation are thinking about and talking about data, and in my book I think that's a great thing, and that's a step along the journey to great conversations happening about data and it being used ethically and properly, and that should deliver a competitive advantage ultimately.
I'm going to agree exactly there, and having worn a data governance hat, data governance is all about understanding where your data is, and when you talk about being able to comply and what good will that do for a company is if you bring in a data governance model, one of the first foundations of that is knowing what data you've got and where it is. And actually, end of the 98 Act, there was really no driver for that. nobody really complied with, as I talked about the 98 Act. Whereas GDPR, because of that fear, everyone's looking at data governance to understand where our data is, and actually when you look at that in a pound, shillings and pence type idea, then we are literally duplicating data across huge amounts of applications and storage places. And if we then start going down that exercise that GDPR demands of knowing where our data is, we can start to then understand how much we're wasting in extra storage and extra. We've got 15 warehouses spread across 16 servers, or all those sort of bits, duplicated warehousing. So actually GDPR drives that. Anybody in the room that comes from a service provider, and I use that in a very general sense, people that sell services to businesses, so there you go. One of the things that Article 28 brought in under the contractual clauses when it comes to a controller and a processor relationship, I've for about the last 3 years as GDPR was coming up said that any service provider that can get themselves to a position of walking in the room and saying, here's our GDPR compliant contractual space, this is what we're looking at, then we'd rather go with somebody like that than somebody who starts saying, well, no, you're not having that in the contract, you're not having that, we're not agreeing to that, when actually the law says it's got to be in the contract. So actually I think looking at it on a different perspective, a different lens, is if service providers have actually taken GDPR on board and want to sell a product throughout Europe, actually walking into a room with a big grin saying, yeah, here it is, we've already done our homework, is an amazing place to be in. My last 6 months has been totally in the contractual space, arguing with companies who don't see themselves as this or won't put that in the contract.
Okay, so I'm now conscious of time. Ladies first, top tip.
Top tip. Don't view GDPR in isolation. I think it's just one part of a framework around data. And obviously I'm biased, but use your data governance framework to start bringing things together so that you can have conversations about data across all data management disciplines across your whole organisation.
Okay, Sebastian?
I think from our perspective, what we're seeing a lot from conversations we're having is companies seeing personal data as a huge liability, which it shouldn't be. It can be a massive driver towards any kind of customer-focused innovation or product development if safeguarded properly. And there are ways doing that and there are tools doing that, and I think it's something to keep in mind that GDPR shouldn't inhibit you to work with data, but it just has to be done the right way, and that's important.
Cool. James?
Being the geek, I find it difficult to find one thing. Do security right.
Okay.
Keep GDPR in context. The probability of you being fined is minuscule. Absolutely minuscule. Keep it in context.
And my final comment would be use GDPR. So what we've done is as a water company, we work in 5-year cycles. Data, information, insight to action is one of 5 strategic pillars that Thames Water is going to be working on over the next 5 years. We've announced that. So use it to influence and change things with your boards. It needs to come from board level, but it also needs to come from ground level as well. Do both and do them both at the same time. Thank you.